Hi, friends. Welcome to the God and My Girlfriends podcast. We are so glad you're here. Hi, Danielle. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, thanks for having me. It's great to meet the both of you.
I have been following you for a while. You just
Oh,
didn't.
yeah?
Yeah. So you are an Enneagram 8.
Yes.
Yes, me too. So we have that in common. And I was just, when I got into your podcast with Suzanne Stabile, I was just excited to hear kind of what you were doing. And you started talking about this book of yours. And I went out on Amazon that day and bought it. And
That's so awesome.
I just can't even begin to tell you, like, I'd been thinking about my faith journey for a while, and some things that just it just wasn't falling into place for me anymore.
Yeah.
So the concepts in your book, Original Blessing, brought together those thoughts and those pieces that were just kind of flying around in my brain and really helped solidify it. And I thought, I'm not crazy. I'm not thinking about this the wrong way. Like this is a thing. So
Yeah.
thank you
It's
for
a
that.
thing. Isn't it great to know that we aren't like making it up or anything? Like it's a whole thing for a long time.
It is. It is.
It is a thing. And, my second question is going to be how you decided to dive into even the topic of original sin versus original blessing. But before I get to the second question, do you mind just kind of telling our listeners a little bit about your faith background or just your background in general, and then where you are right now, where you live, and just a little bit about yourself?
Yes. Put me in space and time. Yes, I grew up in Texas. I am a parent of a West Texas boy, white boy, and a Lebanese second generation girl. And so my family, my mom's side of the family is Druze, which is a very small kind of sect that's really, really old. And so they kind of came to Christianity late in the game. But my mom had a conversion experience in her 20s. And so she was kind of the first one to sort of do that thing. So we're kind of new to the Christian thing, which I always say, just to say, I didn't have a ton of baggage that some other people that I've pastored and have been around did, because I was still like, oh, that's a thing. Like, oh, that's a rule, or, so I kind of hobbled along or stumbled along into stuff, just not knowing that I was stepping on things some of the times. I grew up Christian, but very openly so. And I went to Episcopal school, which really ended up being formative for me. But we went to a Baptist church. But I had such nice pastors. I had really lovely human beings as pastors. And so that really was great. As I look back, it was such a gift. I went to Baylor and did a religion undergrad. I went to Princeton and did seminary, and so hung out with the Presbyterians. I've worked at SMU, which is Methodist. I worked in a congregational church. I've kind of just been in all the denominations at this point, hanging out for a little bit. I don't think I've hit the Lutherans yet, for probably obvious reasons of the original sin stuff. But yeah, I pretty much hit everybody else. And so I'm a little bit of a theological and denominational mutt. But I was part of the emerging church movement for 20 years. That was a big part of my life. So the church that I pastored was for people who we didn't have that word yet, deconstructing, but people who were trying to rethink their faith in ways to just make stuff wasn't working for them. And they were asking questions. And my church was a place that was sort of artistic and open and collaborative and conversational, where they can ask those questions and be around other people who had that and just feel like they're not the only ones. And so that was, my life for a long time. And then now I'm a spiritual director and a dream worker and a whole bunch of other things. And so, yeah, that kind of gets you to where I am. My husband and I live in Dallas. Both of our kids are in college. So we're in year 2 of empty nest, which has been both bitter. It's been bittersweet. It's sad and also fun.
Yes.
So, yeah, that's me.
Good. Yeah, we both have empty nests too. So we get it.
Go.
Yeah. All of our kids are grown, and it's a beautiful thing. I mean, it's really awesome to see them become who they're meant to be, but it is, it is sad to not have them with us all the time.
Yeah.
Okay, so that second question, what on earth made you decide to research and write a book about original sin?
So I think I just never did believe in original sin. And so it was one of those things that I kept running into. And I was like, something about that does not pass the smell test, but also as kind of an outsider who's trying to learn, quote, or what I thought was Orthodox Christianity. I read all the things and did all the things, and I read Calvin's Institutes, and, I did all the stuff. And then I just was like, this does not make sense. And then when I was a pastor, I think that's when it certainly always bothered me. But when I was a pastor and I saw how it was really affecting people's faith lives in tangible, practical ways, it was so destructive. That's when I just was like, we have got to talk about this differently. And I cannot just reword some things and have this be this sort of nebulous thing in the background. And so that's when I really started thinking about it, I think, more directly. So this has been on my mind sort of my whole life. I often tell the story about how when I was like 5 or 6, I was at Sunday school at my Baptist church. And I asked the Sunday school teacher why it was bad that Eve wanted to be like God, because isn't that why we're at church, to be like God? She was so unhappy with my asking that. But I still think it's a really good question. It's like, so too. Isn't that why I had to get dressed this morning and come up here, is because I'm trying to figure out how to be like God? And like, what are we mad about? It doesn't say she wanted to be God, which I think is what we always act like she was trying to do. And that's not true. So anyway, lifelong questions about this whole shebang. But yeah, when I started looking into it and researching and really trying to figure out, well, what would I say if I didn't say this? And what do I actually think is true? And how have I encountered God? And how would I say that? I was so surprised and happy to find out that really we are the oddballs. It was just I was like, the more I went, I thought, oh, like we're the only ones who think this stuff. And like everyone else is like, yeah, I don't know what y'all are doing with that, And so it felt, instead of me trying to be rogue or, people saying, oh, like here she is going to try to make up this new theology, it was such a nice reclamation of, no, like before things went sideways, this is where everyone was, and this is where a lot of people still are. So, Judaism, which hosted Genesis as a sacred text before we got there, they don't believe in original sin. Islam doesn't believe in original sin. Hindus and Buddhists don't believe in original sin. Like the whole world doesn't, just us. And then Eastern Christians don't believe in original sin. The Celtic Christians didn't believe in original sin. So there's just this little offshoot of Western Christians who just decided this was like a thing. And then we decided it was like the primary thing. And we made it, like now, if you ask somebody on the street, what does it mean to be Christian? They say, oh, we're sinners and Jesus died to save us. And if you asked anyone else that question, in like 300, or if you ask the disciples that question or the early church that question, that's not the way that they would frame it. And I just don't think we even know that. I don't think we even know that that's a thing that we've changed. So all that to say, it got me really interested, and I felt very affirmed that this is something that we have every right to go and grab as ours, because it's been there the whole time.
Yeah. You have a quote. The gospel is not a story of us being separated by sin from God. It's the story of a God who is so faithfully for us and intent on being with us that God became human to help us embody the wholeness and fullness of life we've been made for. It's not a story of separation. It's a story of invitation and participation.
Yeah.
And I love that because it's such an life-giving, thought to have and to base our faith on. It's we're building towards something. We're not shrinking away from something. So my question is, you've been doing this work for a while, of this kind of a translation for people who've been stuck in one way of thinking about Jesus's death or life.
Mm-hmm.
But how do you have that conversation, and what have you learned about that process when you sit with people and start to show them the difference?
Yeah. Well, I think I tend to first point out, like, is it a surprise to you that you sin? Like, do you really, is that the main selling point that Christianity can give you, is that, like, you're not a perfect person? And I've never found anybody that needs to be convinced of that. I mean, we all know people who think they're better than they are at certain, whatever, like, sure. But I mean, I literally have never found a human being that's like, no, I'm perfect. I'm basically God. I mean, maybe they're in a mental institution somewhere, but I have not run across these people.
Right.
And so the whole idea that our pitch for what our faith even is based on something that's not grounded in human experience seems to be a problem to me, right? And so then, usually when I'm talking to someone who's like, well, is that allowed? Like, are we allowed to ask this question? My question is, well, what keeps you in this faith? Like, why does it matter to you? What makes you get up and do this thing? Like, why are you following Jesus? And, I think some have been taught the Sunday school answer of, oh, I think it's because I need saving. But really, when you ask that from the heart or the soul, that's never anybody's answer to this question. And so it's really, for me, in that conversation about getting to the place where we really talk about why we're Christian at all. Mm-hmm. And those answers are way more compelling than, the original sin thing. Well, I'm kind of worried about, going to hell when I die. And I mean, that doesn't keep anyone in faith for very long. Even in the most stringent places where that feels really true for people, there's still this love of Jesus that is part of what makes their faith theirs. And so it's just about tapping into that, I think, and helping them realize that that's actually the heart and the engine behind it for them too.
Yeah, that's important. And I think I heard you say that you saw as a pastor some really tangible ways that original sin impacted people's lives. So what did you see?
Yeah, it was this sense of, I can't do it. It was like, well, I'm a sinner. And so this is how I'm stuck. It was this sort of existential stuckness that I kept encountering. Mm-hmm. And you're right. There's a lot of things that we really can't do, but there's a whole lot of things that we can do. And it's like we sort of, with original sin, put this ceiling on what we think humans are capable of. I remember in seminary, we were talking about the Sermon on the Mount. And one guy was trying to convince us that Jesus told us all of that as a sense of well, after this, you just have to rely on God's mercy because nobody can do all of this. And I was like, oh, I don't think Jesus was joking at all. I am sorry to tell you that I don't think that whole pitch was you are a worm and now have to be at the mercy of God. Jesus was you better do that thing. And I think he meant it. Right. So not only is it a ceiling of this guilt and shame that we get stuck in, we just feel like we're not able to be different or do differently or break a pattern that feels really dangerous or destructive to our lives. It's when we're in that place, it's we feel like we're stuck there because we're not allowed to get out of it, but it also really lets us off the hook for being good disciples because we also assume that we're not capable of doing the stuff Jesus asked us to do. And I think I'm not going to die knowing that I did everything that he asked, but I'm going to at least try, So, that's the kind of stuff that I would see as a pastor. It was just different levels of that sort of existential ceiling that gave us that sense of stuckness of there's nowhere for me to go. I can't do this differently. I'm just human, and it's your sense of yourself is too small and God is not looking at you that way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. It definitely. Oh, go ahead, Stacey.
I was going to say that the first question that when I talk about this concept, even before reading your book, in conversations around that whole, because I come out of a Presbyterian background. And so the whole worm, I'm a worm, we're all just worthless sinners, that kind of a thing. The first question that would come up when I would talk about a concept like this is, well, then if Jesus didn't come to die for our sins, why did he die? And your book addresses that head on too. So tell us more about that.
Yeah, it seems really tragic to me that people that we've almost trained that reaction for people to discount the whole entire life of Jesus and all his teachings and the fact that he came to be with us on this earth as God. Because we've been told that the most important thing he did for us is die so that we can go to heaven later. That just seems so offensive to the whole life that Jesus led for us. So yeah, it always actually breaks my heart when somebody says that, like, well, why would even Jesus come? And I'm like, well, I mean, I would just want Jesus to come again and again and again if I had anything to do with it, right? I just want more. I want more of that. The whole thing is so beautiful to me. And so to discount the entire incarnation of Christ, and everything that he taught us about what it means for us to live in the way of God, that just feels, I can't believe anyone would discount all of that, you know?
Well, and it does take the focus off of Jesus's life and what he did while he was literally walking around on the earth, and how he interacted with people, and what the thoughts that he was shifting between scripture and actual real life experiences and all of that. And that probably serves a purpose, on the broader scale, when you think about, am I going to choose to talk about how we actually walk like Jesus did on earth? Or are we just going to not talk about that and just talk about all the things that we have to do because we aren't enough to, be fully and wholly ourselves?
Yeah. Well, and I think it adds, like, it sort of pulls at the worst sort of American hurriedness of things. Like, we're going to rush to the end. We are already really bad at being present. And so the idea that we're going to zoom Jesus's 33 years of life down to 1 week that mattered, and then we're going to zoom all of our lives down to the death part where we can feel comfortable about what happens later, which, by the way, nobody actually knows. And so, I mean, we're just all guessing. So, I mean, this seems like a fool's errand. It's like, what are the whole life part? We're all just missing. We're making Jesus's life part get fast forwarded. And then we're in the process of sort of discounting our whole presence of life right now too. And I just think that God's unhappy and sad about all of that,
Yeah. And you had an interesting way of referring to original sin, the red sock in the laundry.
Yes.
And that really stood out, I know, to me and to Marcia as well, that it just colors everything else in the laundry, everything else that we believe. So what are the things that are impacted by this view?
Yeah, well, I mean, in some sense, kind of like the red sock in your laundry, everything gets a little bit tinged pink, nothing is pure anymore. Nothing is the color that it was when it was going in any longer when you throw the red sock in. So everything just gets a little bit, tinted and tainted. So, some of the things that I mentioned in the book are baptism. Like, baptism used to be a sign of death and rebirth. And, they took that seriously in the early church. Like, you weren't ready to be baptized in the early church until you were ready to die for Jesus, potentially, truly in real life. Like,
wow.
Someone might knock on your door and are you ready to be like, yeah, he's my guy? And until you felt like you had that level of commitment, you couldn't be baptized, I'm not saying that we even need to keep it at that level. I'm just saying, I mean, things are different now, but the death and life of that sacrament was meant to be so powerful that it gave us this sense that we have an eternal life that we are living in right now. And that actually changes the courage with which we confront our lives. And it makes me so sad that we turned that into being rinsed clean of sins, which, by the way, doesn't make sense anymore, because you only get baptized the one time, and how many times do you have to be rid of sin? Like, that should be an every week thing if that's what visual is.
Yeah.
Hey, I've been baptized 3 times, so
well, there you go. Yeah, that's some people, right? And I actually want to be
a long story. Yeah.
So I wouldn't even be mad.
I didn't want to get baptized, but I didn't want the 3rd time, but the new church I was going to insisted on it. So yeah. Isn't that crazy?
You couldn't even show them the creed and be like, one baptism. It's one of the things that the creed.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm
So
like, you know what? I've already done this twice.
Yeah. It counted. It counted both all the times. I think communion gets really limited. Again, it's like, it's not that communion isn't about Jesus's body and blood, Jesus being broken, but he was broken before he died too. Like, I think he was broken open a lot of times along the way, and we don't get to hold the symbolism of that in communion if we just limit it to his actual death. Him becoming human in a vessel of human life where he just lived as a human being is a kind of breaking for him as God. And we don't even get to talk about that in communion. And we don't get to talk about it as communing either, if we so focus on it being sacrifice. And so I think communion gets really tainted in that. Certainly I talk about how sex gets tainted in that, because that's like the way in which we get the sin nature. So, I mean, that puts on things, right? All kinds of things get really messed up. The point of what Christian life is about, the way that we look toward the end of things, what we value, all of that gets tainted when we start thinking about original sin in that way.
Yeah. And to me, it's also strange to think that there are, sins that we are committing every day that potentially override the resurrection. Like, there's something I'm doing right now that I have to be able to stop doing and repent of. But yet, the message of the resurrection and Jesus's message is not that. So it's just really, it's interesting. Like, is the resurrection enough, or is it not enough? That was one of those pieces that I had kind of floating out in my head when I read your book, and it really helped me to kind of level that noise out and just take some of that out, because I'm not at all triggered now when I have conversations. I had a couple of guys knock on the door a couple of weeks ago to share the gospel with me and talk about all the terrible things that were happening on earth and all the sinful misdeeds of man and all the stuff, and I just found myself sitting back thinking, wow, I am not in the same place you guys are, buddy. I'm just not there. You might as well knock on another door.
Yeah, I'm always like, I have like 2 degrees in this. You do not want to have a conversation with me about this. I've studied all the languages. Like, you don't want to talk. You don't want to talk to me.
So how did Western Christianity get this so wrong? Like, how did we divert over to that when so many other religions and even other sects of Christianity? Because I know that would be some Christians would go, well, of course the other religions don't believe in original sin, but they've got everything wrong. They don't believe that Jesus was, but even like you said, other sects of Christianity or early Christians didn't believe this wasn't the main thing. So how did Western Christianity just like grab onto that and make that the centerpiece of everything?
So it was, the good thing is, well, it's not a good thing. The interesting thing is it was such a small little shift that ended up being so the plate tectonics all shifted toward it. And so it's pretty fixable. And yet, oh my gosh, we've doubled down so many times when we could have turned around so many times in Christian history, and we just kept going down this one path, and it just got narrower and narrower and narrower. So there's not like one definitive thing, but what I talk about in the book is how I think one of the main shifts mentally that the Western church made is they decided that sin was what Jesus defeated. And really, biblically, that's not true. It's death, right? Death is what Jesus defeated.
Right.
So I would say, like, I think it makes way more sense to say that Jesus died for our death. And part of that is our sin, right? But I talk about it in box, like death is the big box and sin goes inside the death box. And for Western Christians, they decided that sin was the box and they put death inside the sin box. Well, all through scripture, if you hear sin and death, like they're buddies, they go everywhere together. They're a package deal. So you can't really separate sin and death, but when you really start thinking about which one is the bigger bad thing, it's death. I mean, I just don't even know how anybody can like debate that death isn't the bigger bad of that. Richard Beck, who is a great theologian and author, says that death is the mob boss and sin are his goonies. And if I had known that quote when I read my book, I would have put it in there because I love him. And I think that's like so funny and well said. So anyway, obviously Easter is a celebration of life over death, of the fact that we can kill God and God is like, hi, here is some new life for you, which just should be the most wonderful news that we've ever heard. And if anything is an elevator pitch, it should be that as Christians, we believe that the strongest force in the universe is life and love, and that there is a God who even death cannot defeat, and that life and love will have the last say when all things are finished. To me, that's so beautiful. And I don't know why we got convinced that sin was the better thing, but it is. I mean, it's very compelling, and it can convince people to give money. It can convince people to show up out of guilt. I mean, it's very practical, right? Gets butts in seats. But I think when the Western Church put sin as the primary thing, that was the problem. And then we just kind of made it more individual and solitary and shame-based. And because those are emotions that are easily stirred in us, I think we just kept rolling, And here we are.
Yeah. And one of the kind of shifts that you make in the book is, if you're having a hard time thinking about what you do without centering sin nature.
Yeah.
Can we call that human nature? Like, is that an easier way of maybe making that transition? So what is that like when you explore that with people?
Yeah. Well, I mean, so I would say, okay, so sin nature, and I think this is something too that people get confused about because they're like, oh, well, I don't believe that humanity is, good. And I'm like, I don't either. I mean, I wouldn't say humanity is good and I wouldn't say humanity is evil. I think humans are humans and we're both. Every day we're both. So I think people tend to think that the setup is you either have a perfect nature or a sin nature. And I am trying to advocate that original blessing means that we have a human nature, which means that we have the capacity for both good and evil in every moment of every day and every choice. And probably it's not that clean of a decision. It's not like we pick one cleanly and then we pick the other cleanly. They're probably a mess and a mixed bag, even when we are choosing. But what I'm arguing against in sin nature is the idea that there's something in us that is born against God, which is that's what the doctrine actually says. It doesn't say we're sinners. It says there's something innately within our natures that does not want to be in communion with God, that chooses to be against God, that is inclined to evil continually. And that is the thing that pushes us. And that is the primary motivating factor of our will, right? And that's the thing that I'm saying I don't believe in. So human nature is simply that you have a will, and that you come from this place where you are deeply connected to God because you are made in God's image. And that connection and relationship is the most true thing about you. But on top of that, you have desire and will and choices and all kinds of opportunities and possibilities. And at every given point, you can choose something that will represent some combination of life and death, of creation and destruction, right? Of life giving and life taking. Like, it's all this. And that the practice of Christian life is the wisdom that comes from us making those decisions over and over again, learning from them and trying to make better ones. So that when we know better, we do better. So that's just human nature. Human nature is just the practice of that. And I point out that, Adam and Eve didn't have a sin nature, but they still had that choice. And they made multiple choices, some of them good and some of them awkward, right? In the garden, they had a mixed bag of choices in the garden. And I think if we just can say that about ourselves, it's just a lot cleaner, and it makes a lot more sense with our actual lived experience.
Wow.
Yeah. Yeah. One of the fascinating things that I found in your book were the ideas, just kind of the possibilities of what Genesis meant to the original readers.
Yeah.
And I think you had 3 ways of looking at it. And the one that really resonated with me was that it was a story of coming to age. Like,
Mm-hmm.
just share a little bit about what that was like to research how others saw that scroll, and just what your takeaways are from that. What do you think?
Yeah. Well, the great thing is, and I say great because I think, gosh, this is why scripture is so fascinating, is that there's just endless layers of meaning on it. There's some things that it doesn't mean. You can't say, well, that story is about a peach. There's limits to what the story means, but there are so many layers to what the story means. And I just named 3 that I thought would kind of give a little hint to that.
Mm-hmm.
But the coming of age idea of Genesis came from rabbinical sources. So some of our Jewish texts that people commented on and said, yes, well, this is, if you understand Judaism, you know that when a child turns 13, they own the Torah at that point. They become responsible for being keepers of the Torah. And so you have a bar bat mitzvah to celebrate and ritualize this moment where you come into responsible possession of this law. That's what they think was going on in Genesis 3. It was like the crossing of the threshold into like, oh, you didn't know before, but now you do. And so now the wisdom choice is something you're on the hook for. When you're 8, you just are 8, but now that you're 13, now things got real. But it wasn't just rabbinical texts. It was also early Christian texts. And again, anytime you say the original, like the way the original here is, we don't know, right? We can only guess. And of course, there wasn't just one way of reading it, but there were, like Irenaeus, certain early church historians that talked about this. It's like, kind of the general assumption by scholars who were dealing with this text in earlier time was that they were children. That what we were talking about in Genesis was that Adam and Eve were young humans and they were children, and that at some point they grew and they were meant to leave. And to me, I just thought, well, why didn't anybody tell me that before? I get that. And we all get that because we've all done that transition. Mm-hmm. We become teenagers and we start asking questions and we think we know better. And then we're like, well, sometimes I don't know better. Sometimes my parents were right. And we have to just do the work of like figuring it out on our own. And that's really part of it. And then, as we talked about, we're all empty nesters. Now we've sent our kids out of the nest. It's part of the process. You can't stay at home forever, right? You got to go. You got to go. So go get an apartment or go get a job or go to college. But there's some place where like, you can't let me do your laundry and make your meal every day because you got to grow up. Mm-hmm. And so the movement outside of the garden was always intended. It was always expected. And it's not something that surprised God. I talk about how in Genesis 2, if you look at, and I don't go into this deeply in the book, but if you look at Genesis 2 and you hear how it continually talks about the fertile field, the fertile land, mm-hmm. You get this picture that there's this huge fertile land that God has created and that the garden is like this little tiny bit of it. And so the idea that God was going to make this whole galaxy of things and this whole fertile land that's got like beautiful stuff growing in it and animals and everything. And it says it's not ready yet for a human to tend it. Like this sense of like, oh, but there will be one day. And then the idea that we're supposed to stay in this tiny little corner of God's creation for all time. It was never going to be that, it's like designed for us to move out of. And so this whole thing where we decided that it was so punishing and that we were supposed to stay there and be children the whole time with God, it's just not in the text. Mm-hmm. So once you start looking at it, you're like, oh my gosh, how did I not see this before?
Yeah, that and the word sin never even comes up in Genesis 3.
Yeah.
Wow.
It's not even there.
Yeah. There's so much that was added to the text, to the teachings that I grew up in. So this sort of a thing is just mind blowing. And this whole book is just full of, oh my gosh, that just blew my mind. Like there's a quote that you said, why did he spend 3 years traveling and teaching if all we needed was for him to walk into Jerusalem and offer himself up for slaughter? I was like, oh yeah.
Yeah.
How did I miss that? Like, if it was just about him coming and dying for us and it wasn't about him showing us how to live, how to be, how to treat one another, it's just, I highlighted so much in this book, and I can't wait to like read it again because I know I've missed some stuff. So, thank you so much for being with us today. The book's called Original Blessing, Putting Sin in Its Rightful Place. The author's Danielle Shroyer, and we are just so grateful for the work you're doing and for sharing your time with us today.
Yeah. And tell us a little bit about where folks can find you.
Yeah.
And you have a website called Be a Soul Ninja, so that might be one of those places. You might
Yes. Yeah, so my website is just danielleshroyer.com, and I'm on Facebook. It's just Danielle Shroyer. I don't post very often there. I'm a little bit on Instagram, but I'm not a huge social media person. So Danielle Shroyer on both of those. And then, I do have, if you're randomly interested in kind of listening to a Christian practice Buddhist things from a Christian perspective, that's what Be a Soul Ninja is about. It also has a little bit of like martial arts stuff because I'm a martial artist. And so I've found a lot of like wisdom in that practice that seems deeply spiritual to me. So I talk about that. It's been pretty dormant for about a year, but I'm about to maybe revive it a little bit with a few posts. But that's just been a really good practice for me to really strengthen kind of my Christian practices by doing it kind of sideways through the Buddhist lens. So that's Ninja. Yeah.
I'm excited. My husband just recently turned me on to, is it Thich Nhat Hanh?
Yes.
And oh my gosh, just a couple of his books he just read, and my son-in-law's into that. So I've been kind of following some of his stuff, and it's pretty amazing. It really is.
Yeah.
So I can't wait to follow your work on that.
Well, thanks. Yeah. He was a beautiful soul who has a lot to teach us about what it looks like to be wonderfully human. So he's a good one to read.
Yeah. Good.
Yeah.
Well, thanks so much for being here. We've really enjoyed the time.
It was great to talk with both of y'all. Thanks so much for having me on.